right, we are live. So,
All right, well, hello everybody. Um, as you can see, we are experimenting with some new streaming tools. So this is an app called That's the actual name of it.
it's either
And
brilliant or not. I don't know.
yeah, I love how every time you reference it, you just have to say but anyway, we're just getting started here. So Mark, how about let's talk about a little bit of what we're doing here.
Yeah, yeah. So this is what we call a twin chat, which got your favorite twins here. I'm Mark. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Pathrate, and
Yeah, and
Paul,
I'm
you want to?
Paul.
Yeah,
I'm the older twin by 45 minutes, also co-founder of Pathrite. Mark and I have been designing software together for over 20 years now. We started doing that when we were 13, and we've been working on education for about almost 10 years now. Um, and so we talk a lot every day. We take walks, we talk online, and about the future of education and different ideas around it and what works and doesn't. So these talks are kind of an experiment in having those conversations more in public with you all. Because one of the ways that we learn the most is actually by talking to very smart, thoughtful, creative educators and hearing their feedback. So as we're talking, this is obviously just a live stream conversation between Mark and I, but feel free to chime in the chat. Last time we did a live stream, I think the conversation in the chat was even more interesting than what we were talking about, which is kind of cool. So definitely jump in there. Christian and some other Path Rate people will probably be hanging out there too.
yeah. And so today's topic is digital gardens, and in particular, what we think it means for maybe the future of knowledge management, which obviously includes education, and in particular, how you might apply some of the ideas of a digital garden to curriculum. So maybe in your curriculum design or in your teaching, how could you use these concepts? So I think to start out with, though, we just need to probably define our terms a bit. So I can do that. And I think it's helpful actually. This image I'm going to show. This is a nice illustration done by Maggie Appleton, and you'll see more from her later. She's one of the more prominent digital gardeners out there. And this is how she, or where she puts digital gardens in the kind of the public knowledge space. So on the left here, she's got what she's calling chaos streams, which I like that name, but it's like Twitter, what she's calling cozy web groups like chat, Discord, email, all that stuff. Private notes, which could be a text file on your computer or your actual notes app or whatever. And then on the right here, she's got cultivated performance. So these are actually ideas that are more fully fleshed out. They're ready to be presented to the world, like a blog post or a book or a video or something like that. This digital garden thing kind of occupies this middle space, and she's describing it as learning in public. And I think it's actually a new medium because between like these things and these things before on the left and the right, there wasn't really a middle thing. Like that all happened in private. That happened in your private notes. It happened in maybe your team's project management tools, but no one gets to look inside and see how these ideas developed. And a lot of the reasoning for that is because the tools themselves weren't really, um, it wasn't, it was difficult to expose that knowledge. So we're going to be showing like a few different examples of digital gardens, and then also describing some of the tools and ways that you can use digital gardens in an educational context as well. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add on the digital garden side?
Yeah, I think like kind of like a real garden in a that's not super well tended. This digital garden way of thinking about information and organizing and creating it is very like new. So it is kind of sprawling, and the different things you can do with it are just kind of spiral everywhere. There's so many use cases, but I think we'll be trying to hone in, if we can, a little bit on like how could this actually help you create better curriculum for things that you're teaching and connect it to your students. And then on the other side, what are the implications of this digital garden way of organizing curriculum for the learning process itself for the learners? So those are the kind of the two things we're going to hone in on, but they're just a fair warning. There are so many other threads you can follow when it comes to this kind of thinking in public digital garden way of writing and organizing information.
Yeah, there will almost always be some rabbit trails in these talks, so just be prepared for that. All right. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, and then I have a few notes that might be helpful just to kind of frame the discussion and talk through. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And let's get, okay. So I am using a tool called Roam here. If you've watched previous Twin chats, you've probably seen this tool appear. It's a little bit hard to describe concisely, but it's basically a graph-based note-taking tool. And I find it very useful, not only in the digital garden pattern context, but also just in general, like processing thoughts or outlining things. So I'm going to use this just as a way to frame what we're talking about here. And the first question, what is a digital garden? One of the cool things about a digital garden and the style that it's presented in is that it's got these wiki-like links, and I can shift click here and open up in the side panel all my notes on the digital garden. And so I've got here a digital garden is a place where you can let your ideas and work grow in public. So it's got that garden metaphor going on. It's not, this is the same image I was showing before. It's not so much about the showpiece, like the end result of it, but more of the journey it takes to get there. I have a note that it's kind of like behind the scenes look at a movie. So like the making of, you get to see the special effects and you get to see the actors standing in front of the green screen and see kind of how the whole thing came together. And you can think of a digital garden as like a way of seeing how a particular thought or piece of knowledge was developed over time. So, and some people take this quite far. So this guy, Andy Matusek, he'll come up again later as well. He actually has a few times done like a live Twitch stream, which is more associated with people, doing game streams. But he's done like a live Twitch stream of him just taking notes and working on tending his digital garden. So it's kind of a performant knowledge management thing, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon. And I kind of like to think about it as browsing someone else's brain. So if they've got enough stuff in there and they've got it all connected, it's like you get to kind of go down their trails of thought and see how things are connected. And I know, like, yeah, Paul, are you gonna jump in there?
Yeah, like one thing that might be helpful to show is just like, when you open that little note in the sidebar there, how did you do that? And like, what's happening when you did that?
Yeah, so that's just a way of contextually opening up this note, which I can now minimize. But if I went directly to that note, say like this, that's the same note. I've got it open twice now. I can see all the pages that link to that. So today, we're talking about digital, are all the pages that I've linked to digital gardens before. And I've mentioned it quite a few times, as you can see, all the way going back to May. And so it's got this idea of backlinks, and we'll talk about that more. But it also has like a graph idea to it. So every note I take in this tool called Roam or in another kind of garden style tool is kind of a point on a graph. And so I can open this graph of just this page. So this is the graph of Twin Chat. And you can see all the different times I've linked to it and all the different topics. So a lot of these topics are actually from today in my notes for this particular chat, but you can see all the different times I've mentioned it on my daily journal and just how everything is connected to that. And there's a lot more stuff you can do with this tool. Maybe perhaps another day we could do like a more comprehensive overview of Roam. But yeah, it's a pretty powerful and cool way to build things. So one thing I did want to do though, Paul, if you didn't have anything else to add, is just to show a few digital gardens, like some examples of it.
Yeah, let's look at these. And again, like these are pretty cool, and they're fun to browse around. Like Mark said, it's kind of like following somebody's thoughts and getting to know their brain. But they're still pretty early too, so there's a whole lot of like experimentation happening with this way of organizing the information. But yeah, let's look at Andy's here.
Oops, I got zoomed in there. So that's Maggie's, and then these are Andy's notes. And this was probably, I'll start with this one because this was probably like the first more mainstream website where people started recognizing this pattern. And it doesn't seem like anything profound at first, but you've got just kind of general notes. There's not really any overarching structure to these. It's just, you start here and then he links to a few things here. And when I hover over this, you get this little tooltip that shows like a preview of whatever that is linked to. And I can click on that and it opens up here on the side. And then down here, I can see every single note in the system that links to this note. So this is the idea of backlinks again. And I can hover over those and see that. If I wanted to go say Evernote titles or like APIs, if I thought that was interesting, I could open that and it just keeps stacking over here. And I can keep going. Like I can just kind of drill into this guy's brain and figure out where he got all these ideas and just keep clicking. And a lot of these are really fascinating and well written if you're interested in this space. So I definitely recommend checking out Andy's notes. It's just notes.andymatusek. And we can probably share some links in the description after we're done too. But it's just a cool way to kind of dig into his thoughts. So that was probably like the main, like it's still kind of one of the best examples of a digital garden, even though he wouldn't necessarily call it that himself. He does have this idea of evergreen notes, which is also where this comes from. And yeah Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, what's interesting about this is, like, to me, this way of reading and connecting ideas feels like far more natural than just linear reading through like a blog post or flipping through a book. Because you can kind of choose your own adventure through the information and just click on anything that strikes your fancy. And since it has those linked references below, you'll find if you're really interested in that particular thing, you'll find anything else that is connected to that particular idea. And so I've got this image up here behind me, just illustrating what is actual like curriculum. And when we're trying to design information for people to learn from it or for people to teach from it or both, what are we doing? And I think what we're doing is connecting ideas. So you could look at all these dots up here and see those as connected ideas that form some kind of pattern of thought that's powerful. And there's some cool things about that. Basically, like for one, when we connect concepts, which is what we do when we construct knowledge, it's actually kind of timeless. Like there are many ideas that originated from people we've never met. They were, hundreds or thousands even of years ago when they connected all these thoughts, but we still build on them and use them. So they're timeless. And what that means is like the content and knowledge that we create can actually scale. Like it's very transportable. Books were an amazing innovation for making it more transportable and cheaper to print. And now the internet, of course, does that even further. And that's why I think, bringing it back to online education, most of the online courses out there, not all of them, tend to be kind of content curriculum centric, because that's the most scalable thing, is like basically you just get access to all this information. But that's a little bit different than teaching. I don't know, Mark, would now be a good time to go into that, or would you want to dig into that later?
I mean, we could jump to that. We can kind of just bounce around. I don't know if we should show some more examples or just link to them later.
Yeah, we'll bring some up, I think, as we go. Like, I think one thing that is interesting to me that we've been thinking about a lot, and I'd be curious to hear you all's feedback in the chat, but is like the difference between teaching and curriculum. And Christian, actually, who's facilitating, has a really great blog post on our blog about this. I think it's called Yet We Act Like They're All the Same, I think is the title of the post. Because actually, like most education software and a lot of online education does kind of flatten these two things. But what I think teaching it's basically connecting people with ideas. So it's not the same as just connecting ideas to other ideas and constructing something that's a model, like a mental model or some kind of practice or skill like that, or mechanism. It's actually trying to help people understand why it matters, connecting it to them personally in like a felt way. And that's what really great teachers do. So if you can see kind of this person here in the middle, they've got a lot of connections to the concepts, but more what they're doing in this case is they're connecting the people to the concepts. And that's what really good teachers do. They connect people to concepts. And because of that, I think teaching is inherently more temporal. It's more like context based, like it's going to happen in a workshop or a classroom or at home. It's going to happen in time and space, unlike making connections to ideas. And that's why teaching is much harder to scale. Like we've seen in online education, lots of attempts to try to scale teaching, and none of them really work because they end out just kind of being like scaling out curriculum. So that's kind of like a side trail there, but just trying to differentiate and kind of hone in on like what are we talking about when we're talking about curriculum, which is more on this knowledge side, versus teaching, because those often get very jumbled up in practice.
Yeah, and I think too it can be tempting to think, even with this digital garden kind of metaphor, to think that if we just provide the right knowledge, like we give them the right structure, the right scaffolding, um, then that's what they need to learn the topic. When in reality, oftentimes the structure itself doesn't actually click until you've had enough actual experience with the thing that you're trying to learn. So I teach a web design class, for instance, and I've done it for 12 years now, and it's for graphic design students. And so most of them have never seen HTML or CSS or written any kind of code. And I've learned over and over again that just teaching them the vocabulary, the syntax, which is kind of necessary to even get started, or even having them go through drills like code challenges and exercises, does not actually, it doesn't actually lead to the ability to just make something from scratch. So like the actual work that needs to be done. And so one of the things I do like about this more graph-based, digital garden-based approach to the knowledge, though, is that you actually get to see, I think, ideas and knowledge in action. It's almost like they're in motion, because you see how they've developed like iteratively, and you see everything they're connected to. You actually get a more, I think, applicable real-world action-oriented version of the content that you're looking at, not just the final presented polished thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one of the things I like about the more graph style of transmitting that knowledge.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a good segue into like why in the world are we even hosting this conversation and trying to introduce people to this digital garden idea? It's because we think it's really profound and it has like a lot of implications for the future of creating content that's educational in nature and actually experiencing it and learning from it. So why do we think that? Well, for one reason, Mark and I both started using the tool he showed before, Roam Research, in earlier this year, and since then it's just kind of really revolutionized the way that we both organize our thoughts and the way that we write and the way that we plan things. Like I probably spend like 30 to 40% of my day now actually writing in Roam, and the key thing it does, it just helps me make these connections to other things that I've written. And as we used that, we started realizing more and more over time, okay, well, wow, if actual curriculum worked this way, all the knowledge that we had that's been developed that we want to like connect with in some meaningful way ourselves, it would just be a really amazing tool. So it kind of opened our eyes to some ideas about what curriculum should be that perhaps is really not right now. So maybe Mark, could we talk through that right now? Is like, what if we were gonna, like, just in an ideal world, talk about like what should the best curriculum do, the most effective curriculum do, like what would it do?
Yeah, I mean, I think just at the top level, it would need to be more self-directed and exploratory than most of it is right now, because of the nature of the medium, kind of the document as like the way of transmitting curriculum, whether it's in a book or online. We still tend to think in pages, but that doesn't really afford any kind of self-direction or rabbit trails or exploratory styles of learning, which in my experience, personally, but also just watching my students learn, it's very non-linear, and everyone knows this. Like learning does not happen in a linear path. The reason we have paths is to try to keep everyone together. It's kind of logistical. It's also clarifying when you don't know what's next if someone else tells you. So it is necessary, but actual real world learning usually happens in a pretty non-linear way. Like, so the actual hands-on work might be different for every single person. And in fact, I would say it definitely is. So I think that's one thing that's immediately obvious, is just that this graph style of learning, it supports that more fluid, I'm going to jump over here and I'm going to work on this thing, but it's all still connected. It's not like you lost your place.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea to talk around. Is like, I think most of us, and I would, if somebody disagrees with this, I'd be definitely curious to hear your critical feedback. But I think most people that I've come across would recognize that knowledge looks something more like this. It looks more like this kind of connections between all these different concepts that become more and more intricate and form patterns over time. And that knowledge doesn't really look like this. It's not like this kind of linear sequence that everybody, once we get this sequence, then we know something deeply and we've mastered it. It doesn't really look like that. But why in practice, though, like Mark said, it kind of does look like that. Like curriculum is often presented in a very linear sequential way. So why is that? Well, I think the first reason is because of the medium, like the medium of books, for instance, which are really powerful, cheap to produce, transportable ways of packaging knowledge, kind of force it to be linear because it's on a page. So there's no way to really make a lateral connection to it or make an unexpected leap like you can kind of in real life when you're learning something when you're looking at it on a page. So again, not dissing books at all here. Books are amazing, but there is a constraint that this medium affords that is kind of difficult here. And actually, Mark, maybe we should talk about that term affordances.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So I think we've mentioned this before, and it's one of my favorite terms, so I'm sure I'll be using it more often. But an affordance in a design context is a design or shape that suggests the action you should take with it. And so a good example of an affordance would be like a doorknob. Since it's round and it looks like a handle, it suggests that you actually turn it. Or a light switch. It's kind of sticking out of the wall at an angle. It suggests that you flip it. Like the shape itself affords the action that you want people to take. And there was a good comment in the chat talking about tools shaping thinking, and even like connecting that to the idea of language itself shaping our thinking. Paul's got a funny.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite Far Side comics from Gary Larson here. But despite the affordance here, so like a good example of affordance is like if you try to open a door, if you've ever tried to like push on a door when you should have pulled, like this guy's doing, usually it's not the same mistake this guy's making. Usually it's because if you had to push and it has a handle, you're going to pull it every time because a handle affords the idea of pulling. Whereas if you're pushing, it really should be like a flat kind of push panel on the door. And so people will make mistakes and run into doors and stuff like that all the time if the handle is on the wrong side. In this case, this guy's just completely missing the sign and the handle, so not getting the affordance either way. I don't know if we can help him.
It is a school for the gifted. Maybe they can help. Yeah. But back to that idea, though, like tools themselves and language itself, different languages have different affordances. And so the idea of linguistic determinism, for instance, is the idea that you can't think thoughts that your language doesn't naturally express, or it's very difficult to fully understand something without knowing the vocabulary for that particular domain. And I think there's also a technological determinism to this too, in that without the right tools, the environment that people are working in, whether it's like a book or a blog post or a video, can only afford certain actions. And what we're interested in is thinking like, well, what does this graph style, this digital garden style of notes afford that other tools don't? And I think it's quite a few things, and some of them are profound.
Yeah, I would say I mean, working with this new digital garden type medium where you can just interlink everything and you can find these unexpected connections really highlights kind of the limitations of the books as a medium. But not only that, obviously we're on the internet now and we can do more than just like what a book does. However, if you think about it, like a web page is still using a book metaphor. It's still binding all the information and the thoughts and ideas that are constructed within it into a page. So like web pages kind of look something like this more, where the thoughts themselves are still very kind of have a linear presentation. You can't like jump from one thought to another connected thought and kind of trace the path to it.
Yeah, it's like all vertical scrolling for the most part.
Right. I mean, you can link within from one thought, you can link to another page. So I guess that's an
and then you're also losing context when that happens too. So
yeah, that's true, because like now you don't see the connection anymore. You're just at a new place. So it's really like with all the potential of the internet as a medium and screens that can digitally display ideas in any way we program them to, like we really haven't done much of an evolution in the way that we organize knowledge. And it's actually getting a little bit worse because now when you hit the web pages, like you get all these pop-up ads and newsletter signups and things like that. So it's really the web is in a pretty bad spot for organizing knowledge and connecting to it, particularly in any kind of teaching or learning oriented way.
Yeah, and this might actually be a good time to do a detour into kind of what's happening now that has caused these digital gardens to emerge now, but also like some older ideas that just never actually made it to the web in the early days. That actually afford this kind of thing. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. There we go. So I have this like prompt, why are digital gardens emerging now? And I think some of that may be related to COVID-19. Everybody's online and has more time to sit around watching other people learn online. I don't know how much of that will last. I hope it does. I've really enjoyed some of the live streams that happen and some of the talks that people give. In fact, if you're a hardcore Roam user or part of the Roam cult, that's what they call it on Twitter, people will do like a show your Roam style stream. And I think, Paul, you were in one of those, right?
Yeah. I was interviewed and just kind of gave a tour of how my Roam notes are organized.
Yeah, and part of the reason you can do that though is because the tool itself affords that kind of exploratory presentation. But none of these ideas are super new. I'm not sure if you've ever come across the idea of a memex, but it was this pretty interesting thing that developed by Vannevar Bush in a book in 1945, so well before computers. And his job was like technical and sciencey, and he was cataloging lots of information for the war. And it was just very difficult to organize. And so he had this kind of mechanical Turk style idea that he could connect somehow all his notes with this like robotic device that lived in his desk, and he called it a memex. It's just kind of funny in hindsight, but a lot of the writing and the thinking around it was actually the inspiration for hypertext, which came later. And so hypertext itself, the first version of it, had this idea of backlinks built in. So for instance, if I click on the hypertext page, I see all these linked references here. That's not how the web works though. Like in Paul's drawing, if you click a link, you're just on a different page. You lost the context. You don't know how you got there. But originally, backlinks were supposed to be part of hypertext and built into the browsers. It just wasn't done. And then I'm going to blow the screen up a bit just to make sure everybody can see. And then the other thing, like the other big thing, was the idea of transclusions. And a transclusion is basically the ability to include one block of content from one document into another document without losing the link between those things. So this is a pretty foreign concept. And actually, as far as I know, there aren't really many usable tools that do this other than Roam. So Roam can do transclusions, and it's kind of like the first usable tool that does this. But a transclusion is basically, we've got document B here with this text foo, we got document A, and then I'm transcluding foo into A. So I'm kind of remixing it into this. And Ted Nelson, the guy who coined this term, he worked on this project Xanadu, which is like the most 80s sounding software name possible, I think. And he worked on it for 30 years and it never launched. There's a really fascinating Wired piece about this, actually. I think Project Xanadu, like the most famous ghost software or ghostware. And it's a pretty interesting profile of Ted Nelson himself. He's a kind of a really interesting guy, a bit eccentric. But his idea was that basically the internet itself should have block level references to everything that's being used that go back to the origin, like who created it, how many iterations did it come from. You don't really need to cite your sources when it comes to a system like this because everything is automatically linked because of these transclusion things. So it's a really interesting idea. It was just never implemented in a way that was actually practical until Roam came along. And then this guy, who actually works for Roam now, mocked up this idea of transclusions in Roam, and you can see it here live. So because Roam works as blocks, you can see exactly where each block is coming from in the original source. And that's huge. Like that is a big deal. Word documents don't work like that. Note systems don't work like that. The affordances that allows for the future of knowledge management and innovation is really, really interesting.
I know when I first started using Roam, like just getting the page links, so you can embed like links to other pages, which are essentially like a note that you've written. Just getting used to doing that was like the kind of the first step, and very cool though, because you could make all these connections that were very easily are very hard to make in any other format, this page based and document based. But getting those kind of transcluded, like transclusions in there and learning to write that way, that was kind of like phase 2, but that's just amazing. So for example,
and I can show you how that works, like the transclusion that Paul's talking about. In Roam, you just do this.
On your screen
yeah. Yeah, let me go in further.
Enlarge the browser. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. So I'm going to show how transclusion works. And it is kind of like Paul was saying, it's something you have to kind of get used to because no tools like this work like this. But say I wanted to include a quote in some article I was writing that maybe let's do the map is not the territory. So I'm searching all of my blocks. Those are every single bullet point in my database. And that gets replaced with an ID. But when I go down here, now I've got this transcluded into this part of my notes, but it's still linked directly back to the source. So if I click on it, I can jump to the actual block itself, which will navigate to that block, or I can open it up in the sidebar, which I've got a lot of things open in my sidebar right now. Let me minimize this stuff. Yeah, so that is linking to helix theory, axioms, the map is not the territory, which is where I transcluded that block from. And that's also a line on the graph. So if I was looking at this in graph view, I would see this reference from TwinChat to that particular statement. So it's a pretty powerful concept, and it does take a little bit of getting used to write that way. But I think it also has some really interesting applications for education, and in particular curriculum.
Yeah, completely. And I think this gets to like the question we were talking about earlier is like what is like affected curriculum, like ideally, not what we know about it. Like we've all experienced curriculum mainly through some form of a book or sometimes like a video that's recorded or audio that's recorded. And that's pretty much the limits of how our experience has been. Like anything on the web is kind of very book-like in nature often. But what would curriculum be like in an ideal world? And I think the digital garden Rome style is closer to it, because one of the things that I think is key is that you could actually contextualize a core idea. So if you can see in this illustration here, the golden connected nodes here, these concepts that are connecting to this knowledge pattern are being connected to here by these other kind of faint purple lines, but then they can also be contextualized in a different way by connecting this other knowledge to it. But the core idea remains the same. So that sometimes when you come across like that term evergreen in a digital garden, what they mean is like they've got a core concept that is kind of decontextualized knowledge, is component knowledge that could be remixed and reused in many different cases. So like maybe Mark, could you share a way that you do that perhaps in your web design class?
Yeah, I mean, I won't say the way I do it is perfect or brilliant, but I can show an example here. Let me just switch to the screen share again. All right.
Well, I think like kind of like a hypothetical example, which I think you do, is like when you're teaching people to make a web page, you might teach them how to do that in HTML and CSS, but also in Webflow, and then
Right.
maybe also in Squarespace. And you're still, though, you have some core concepts around what it takes to build a web page that you're building off of, and then you're recontextualizing it. And that's really like back to our view of what teachers are doing here. That's what they're doing. They're actually creating contextual knowledge that kind of fits the situation and the people that they're teaching. But really great curriculum should kind of have this affordance where these key ideas remain fixed and kind of component based, but can then be referenced and remixed everywhere. Mark, I think you're muted. All right, Mark is on mute currently.
Yeah, sorry about that. Did you want me to actually show like how I use it on the Pathrate side, or?
Yeah, that'd be cool. Like to see kind of how you develop your web design curriculum.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's get that pulled up real quick, and then I'll switch over to it.
All right.
All right. So this is still kind of a work in progress, and actually, this class hasn't officially started yet, so it's still in the planning phase. But that's a good setup to kind of demo this idea in. So on the right here, I've got my class path in Pathrate. And on the left, I have my Rome notes for this cohort. So I've got the fall 2020 cohort, and I've got these different sections in there. So I'll write down like outcomes. I link to the cohort path, which is what I've got open right here. And I'll switch to student view of that. And then just ideas about methodology that I want to try this semester. And I haven't like fully developed all of these ideas, but I'm thinking of using these kind of pedagogical techniques in a way that I can remix as well. So if I say like, maybe I want to try more immersion, like immersion style learning in the medium of the web. So it's kind of the idea that when you learn a language, it's easiest to learn in the culture that speaks it. And so in a sense, if you're learning web design, it's easiest to learn on the medium itself. So the class being all online, for instance, is an affordance there. But if I wanted to make this a remixable thing, I can just tag that as a page. And now I've got immersion as a link on my graph that then I can reuse anywhere or link to. And you could do that with all of these. So I'll plan out my methodology that way. I'll actually write out emails and stuff like that in there. Any tasks that I have, getting ready to set up. And you can kind of just organize this however you want, which is one of the cool things about these kind of open-ended graph systems is they don't really come with folders for you or structure out of the box. You can kind of determine how you want to do it. But the way I use it for actual curriculum development is in the path outline here. So I'll drill into that. And you can see kind of at the high level, I've planned these first 3 lessons. And so my introduction, which maps to my welcome step here. And actually, you know what? Let's see, did I not? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So I've got my welcome, my intro, which I outlined pretty in depth, both of these and what to expect. And I find this method of like kind of outlining and even writing in Rome easier to develop the things because of for one, because of the nested structure, partially because you can drill into any particular bullet and just focus on that one thing, which is helpful. But then also because of that transclusion and block reference thing, like I could transclude any other bullet points I have that I've written before. So I go through all that stuff and I'll show you what this looks like in Pathrate. I haven't added all the images and stuff, so it's a little bit boring looking right now. So I need to publish that. So that's my intro that I wrote, and then I can translate that also to the what do you expect. That's what it looks like on the Pathrate side. Next is the tools we need is kind of setup instructions, which again, I could reuse these once I've written them in Rome at whatever future cohort I want. And so I just kind of go through each section. And so there's a let's get to know each other section, and then week 1, and I do the kind of the same thing for each. And actually for video, it's quite helpful as well. You can kind of prep all the notes for what you want to cover, any assets that you want to reference, you can outline that all in Rome, and then it makes the actual writing of the documents or recording of the video much easier.
Yeah, and this is actually a good principle to bring up. So like the Rome is this amazing tool for connecting all these ideas, but it pairs really well with some kind of more conceptual methodology for writing and organizing writing. And there's a really cool method called the Zettelkaisten method, which is something that I think he was a academic social philosopher, 50 or more years ago, who obviously didn't have a computer, but he came up with this method for writing that was kind of amazing and made him very prolific and write. I think he wrote over 60 books in his lifetime, and then they published like 10 more after he passed. But the way he did it is he would write these Zettelkasten in German means box. It means little box. And basically he had these boxes in a cabinet that he would put little note cards in. So every time he came across something he was reading and it sparked like a component thought that was interesting, he would write it down on the note card. And so it had to be like a pretty small sized thought, but then he would write an index on it and he would put it in with other cards that related to that topic. And yeah, so Mark's got a good picture of the actual Zettelkasten.
Yeah, that's the real deal. That was what he used. Yep.
Right. And so since he had this system for connecting things, it helped him actually just write short form things. And I know for me, that's been one of the most powerful things about writing in this way, is that it's way easier if I'm going to write like a blog post or I'm writing something for a path. It's way easier to write just one little part of it, like a note card size thought. And then you can then piece them together. You can find what they relate to. And so instead of like starting to write something from a blank page, which is really stressful and hard, you actually start with, over time, like this abundance of information that you can piece together. And it really becomes more of like this editorial job of trying to thread it all together in the right sequence. But it's just made writing anything so much easier, whether it's curriculum or a blog post or anything.
And the fact that you like when you write that way, then you can reuse those component thoughts like in other contexts. That's, to me, that's like amazing. It's almost like if you're a programmer, this kind of concept makes sense because you write like small blocks of code that are called functions that you can reuse throughout your code base. So I might write one function that could maybe it takes an email list and looks up users by their ID and returns the user data. Well, I could use that function anywhere in the code base now that I've written it. And that's one of the powerful concepts in programming, is that composability. But that doesn't really exist in writing until these kind of tools afforded the idea of transclusion. And when you couple that with this component-based writing technique, like that kind of index card block view of writing, then that's even more powerful, because then you actually do have composable thoughts.
Yeah, so one example of how I use this, I'll just briefly scan through this without the details. So I use the tag Evergreen, like a lot of people that use this tool and the digital garden idea to show an Evergreen note. So this is my Roam database here, and this is just the page for all of my Evergreen notes. And so anything I tag with Evergreen shows up here. And so every time I have an idea that I think I've developed to a point where it's ready to actually share with somebody, so I could tweet this out, I could include it in a blog post, I could include it in some curriculum somewhere that I'm putting together, then I tag that with Evergreen. Everything else kind of stays in this draft area. But you can see I have quite a few of these. And the cool thing about them is that they all like are already interrelated. So I can have, like in this one, I'm quoting Thomas Hobbes, but it came from How to Read a Book, which is a great book by Mortimer Adler. It's tagged to these other ideas. So it makes these component notes very easy to discover. Like I don't have to manually write them down on an index card and then find those connections. And I found that the process of doing that, going through that, helps me make connections that I wouldn't have made otherwise. I would have forgotten them. They would have been lost in my mind or buried in some notebook that I wrote down somewhere. So it's been pretty amazing. And I think it's pretty cool to think about, like, what would that look like? You know, it's very helpful for developing curriculum, but what would it look like if students could actually experience curriculum in that way? I think one of the cool things about it is you can see how the knowledge developed, kind of basically, and what it connected from. So for example, I think one of the biggest issue with the kind of the page-based curriculum that we have now is that once you publish the blog post, or it gets published in a book, it's pretty fixed in time. It kind of appears that way to the students too, even though that's not how it was developed. Whereas if you're using this kind of more component-driven style and you're interlinking things, you can actually kind of see how things got connected over time, and how they evolved. And I think that's really important, because I know when I was in school, often when I learned any particular kind of like idea or skill, and the more profound it was, the more it seemed this way. It seemed almost like it had come down like from heaven on tablets written in stone, or that like some like really smart person just stubbed their toe on this idea one day and it emerged fully formed, when that's almost never the case. Like all ideas that last have developed over time and through like often discussion and trial and error, and like there's kind of like this evolution to ideas, and the way that they're packaged in these linear formats and presented this way makes it seem like these were already constructed, and it kind of gives you the wrong idea about learning or contributing to knowledge, like even academically. So I think that's a really cool kind of affordance that the Roam style digital garden has, is that it like inherently shows you the connections and also kind of invites you to go ahead and start making your own connections to it over time.
Well, and I think it's just right now, it's just the tip of the iceberg of the potential for these kind of graphs. Like there's also a financial side to this, and it was actually part of Ted Nelson's original vision, was the ability to attach what he was calling micropayments to an individual block or reference. And so not only did you have like proof that this was the person who authored this originally, you can also see the iterations on it like Paul is describing, but you could also say, well, I want to transclude, that text or that video or that assessment or whatever you're transcluding, And you could pay the author for that, but only for what you're using. And so that's another thing from like the world of programming. Oftentimes when you're setting up like say a cloud service to host like, software like Pathrate, we pay based on what we actually use. So the amount of resources we're using, it's not just like a flat rate no matter what, depending on how you structure it. And that has typically not been possible with curriculum because they don't actually know what you're using. Like it's not actually obvious which parts of the textbook you're using or which part of the video DVD library or whatever, but this kind of block level, graph level way of doing it would actually allow for that kind of business model to exist.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, but like the fact that it does a couple of things. Like one, there's no need to like really cite sources in this model because you can just click into the source and it's there. And because of that, then you actually can sell component knowledge in a sense, or at least be credited for it just inherently. The medium itself works that way. It's not like a feature that they build into it necessarily, although I think some kind of micropayments would be necessary for that to work really at scale. But if you think about it, like why does like commerce on the web kind of work the way it is right now? Like, so if I'm trying to buy this course that's going to be displayed through my browser, like I kind of have to pay a lump sum for everything that's sequenced together within it. I can't just buy a single part of it, or just try out a single part of it. And I kind of have to experience it in that way too. Same thing with like, advertising works when somebody makes the click, like we're showing here. They click from here to here to this other page, like boom. And that's how the monetary system works. But a lot of that monetary system is not like a natural thing that would have developed inherently. It's actually shaped very much by the medium itself and kind of limited to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some good comment in the chat here that this is actually like happening with micro credentialing as well. And if you're thinking about it like a graph as an education in an educational context, that's really powerful because not only are we dealing with maybe like pieces of knowledge, like little knowledge blocks in different various media, but we could be dealing with competencies, or we could be dealing with like projects that you actually worked on, and you can show the full development over time. And then those can be used as a way of credentialing. So it's not like a rolled up diploma where I have taken all of these required classes and passed them, and therefore I get the certificate, but it's a much more granular version of like what did you actually do and what competency was assessed, but individualized to the learner themselves based on their actual experience, not just some certificate that said they went through all these things.
Yeah, and maybe this would be a good time to talk through some of the ideas we're thinking about as far as like how this impacts how we design Pathrate and how some of these new digital garden patterns might apply there. So what would be a good example maybe to start with there?
I mean, I think we've already been talking about it a little bit, but I think one important difference between what we've been showing with Rome in like an educational context is that I think the material, if you want to view it that way, so the little dots on the graph in an educational context are more useful if they are tied to a creative action. And so, we're firm believers at Pathrate that learning happens through action. That's why when you create a step in Pathrate, you have to pick a verb that goes with it. Some of that is just like a pedagogy thing. It's like helping the student know what to do more clearly and keeping the steps at the right level of granularity. But it's also because we believe that primarily learning happens through action, not by passive knowledge transfer. And I would think most people would agree with that. And so when we think about a learning graph, it's not just about like the component notes or like the media resources themselves. It's also about the action they took and the evidence for that action. So when we're thinking about a learning graph, we've been talking about it in the idea of a contribution or a creation as a point on the graph. And that may connect to all kinds of knowledge or other people or whatever. But the primary thing you're looking at when you're assessing a credential or competency is the actual contribution itself.
Yeah, so like in your class, maybe that would look like your students on a submit step, they submit like their wireframe sets, and then later they make an actual designed, developed site from those wireframes. And using something like a learning graph, you could actually see like, oh, well, these wireframes then evolved into like this design and this project, and then I can also tie like whatever feedback I helped them with that's tracked in the system is also related to it. So I could like filter the learning graph and say like, okay, well, what when did Mark help, let's say Lindsay on this particular project? And then all of those ideas, all those connections, all those nodes are already there and they're already connected.
Right.
It's not like a report that we have to make.
Yep.
Um, and I think that gets especially powerful when it comes to like a mentorship type scenario, because I think a lot of times when we're working on things for mentors and we talk with them about what they're doing, they're not usually standing up in front of a classroom or even a small group and making a lecture-based presentation that they prepared. Instead, what they do actually is they start often by just like looking at the evidence of thought or work that the particular mentor has produced since they last talked. And really what they want to see everything. They want to see the things that they've submitted, the answers that they left, the discussions they participated in, any notes that they want to share. And they want to get this kind of like intuitive sense of like, where are they, what areas are well formed and what aren't. And it's much more like what they're looking for is much more like a graph display than like a canned like report, basically.
Well, and oftentimes like the idea of a portfolio too is the same thing. It's like the reason that construct even exists is because that information is not being captured somewhere else. And so you have to like prepare it in this separate system. And like you have this, and like I remember early on in LMSs, they went on this weird detour with blogs too, which was trying to do a similar thing. It's like trying to get the students to create some artifact that is like evidence for their thinking. And I think if you do a learning graph properly, that is just a byproduct of the way the medium itself works. It's not something you have to build onto.
Yeah, and wouldn't that be cool as a student if like when you're taking and you're learning any particular subject in school and you're answering questions, you're participating in discussions, you're getting feedback, and all of those are being charted on this kind of graph type of way. And so you can say like what's everything I've learned about, design since I started actually learning it. And you could take that with you. Like you can take that with you after school. You can keep connecting new ideas to it because that is how it works in real life. There in real life, like learning doesn't happen in these artificial silos. Like those silos are actually created by our medium. So like one medium is kind of like the book or like the browser that follows a page-based metaphor. Also, like we've talked about the problems with like the classroom context and how that can limit um, these things. But like real learning and development doesn't actually happen in these silos like we think it does. It actually happens in a much more organic, kind of like bottom-up graph-like way. So I think that's where I'm most excited to explore and continue like working on these learning graph oriented ideas. Um, so that's something we are doing at Pathright. We're not super far along on that yet. It's something that's still very much in the exploratory phase, but we're talking with partners about it. We're writing some code and doing some designs. But that's something you can just stay tuned, and you should be hearing more about that.
Well, and that's part of why we're having this conversation in public too, is like if you would like to contribute to the conversation, we need as much as we can. It is kind of a like these graphs and these digital gardens are a newer medium, like we were saying, but building on a learning layer on top of that is even newer. And so like there aren't good examples of this style of learning really. There are some kind of small examples of it, but not as a medium in and of itself. And I mean, I think it's going to be, once it's right, and it's going to take a while, it has a lot of power to it. It can open up and afford so many more types of things that people have been trying to hack LMSs to do or hack other tools to do. It's got a tremendous amount of potential.
Yeah, and I think that's beyond just the education, learning, teaching, research space. Um, I really think that this new way of connecting information eventually will be the way that we primarily interact with information. It won't be this page-based metaphor with like websites that just link to each other, kind of Wikipedia style. It'll be something like a lot more like what we're showing today. That's just my prediction. I think it'll take some time before it gets there. But if you are somebody who who creates and contributes to kind of like the knowledge in the world and you're publishing out there or you're teaching it, like this is something that I think is very important to learn or at least play around with. And I think you'll find it, very helpful just in developing your own thoughts and in publishing more curriculum or work or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So I think that probably about covers as much as we have to cover today. We're getting close to the end of our time. Mark, what are some good resources we could point people to if they want to learn more about this digital garden way of developing content?
Yeah, I think some of the websites we referenced earlier, like Maggie Appleton's site, she's got a lot of good content on that. And Andy McCusick, he's a good one to follow with these things. Anyone in the Rome crowd, if you're on Twitter and you just search for Rome research, you'll find a lot of these kind of things flying around. We could probably put some links though in the YouTube video description once it's up that will link to some of the things that we were talking about.
Yeah, we can put some links in there. Another thing I'm curious about, this is something we've thought about, so this is just kind of an idea out there, not a commitment, but we've thought about making a Rome research course for educators that would actually like teach how specifically you might use Rome to enhance your teaching. So not just developing the curriculum and the paths, but also how you connect with your students, because there's actually a lot of cool like CRM like things you can do with it. So I'm curious, if we were to do something like that, if anybody would be interested in like a Rome research course for educators. I think I'll look in the chat. I think there's like a 30-second delay, so I won't get it until a little bit later. But Mark, any?
Yeah, and if anyone has any general questions too, that's fine. We can do some Q&A.
Yeah. All right, I'm just scanning through there to see if there's any questions that would be interesting to answer here. Looks like a really good, interesting conversation. I'm not seeing any questions that haven't quite been answered yet. Christian made an interesting comment or hot take, that so much of how we put our content in the world has more to do with like the prestige of the format rather than the effectiveness for transformation. I think that's a really good insight.
That is good.
And I think
well, it goes to that.
Well, I was just going to say part of the reason for that is just the medium affords that, because like, especially with books, it's very expensive to publish a book. It's not as much now, but it's like
difficult.
Even 20 years ago, like it's very few people could even get a book published. They only had so many books in whatever categories that they were going to publish, and then it's pretty expensive. And once it goes to press, like you can't change anything. Like you might make a new edition later, but it's a very slow cycle. And so just that medium itself affords this kind of prestige idea, because like really it is kind of prestigious, or was kind of prestigious, to even get something published by a big publisher.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I'm sure we've all heard that quote, the medium is the message, by Marshall McLuhan. And on the surface, that seems very strange. Like, well, no, it's not. The message is the message. But if you dig into the idea of what he's saying there, is that basically the medium itself, so video, TV, books, whatever, has a more profound impact on your life and society itself than any particular message within that medium. A lot of it is related to that affordance idea. It's the medium carries with it a set of affordances and tools that enable a whole new subset of action. And it's going to be really exciting, I think, to watch this kind of new medium of a graph and see what it does to education.
Great. Well, thanks so much for watching and your participation in the live discussion. This will be available for anybody to watch afterwards as well. So if you have questions later and you've watched this, post live, then just leave those out in the comments and we'll definitely answer those. So anyway, I appreciate you all watching and in the discussion. Any parting thoughts, Mark?
Nope. It was a fun conversation.